Hello class, so this is a way for me to show you guys how to set up an essay for a poem, a poetic analysis essay. I'm going to be using the example of Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. So before we even take a look at our poem, I always like to make sure that I have my essay ready to go in terms of Mla format. We're doing Mla format because we're doing a poetic analysis essay, and literature means Mla. That's just what it means. So we're going to open up a Word document. You can do Word or you can do Google Docs. I prefer Word because I think it has a better word processor. So take a look and see if maybe your school or your company allows you to download Office for free. If not, Google Docs is fine. So first thing you want to do is set up your heading. That goes in the top left-hand corner. That's your name, your professor's name, the name of the class, and the date. Underneath that, you want to put your title. Your title is not actually in all caps. I just put it here in all caps so I remember to write an interesting title later, maybe once I read my poem and know what it's about. You also want to make sure that you put in your page numbers. You can do this by clicking on the heading or by going under the Insert tab, and you can find page numbers there too. So make sure that you have your running page numbers. For some reason, my students always seem to forget page numbers. And here you can see that I've already sort of put in something in my essay, and that's our TPCASTT. This is the way that I teach my students how to look at a poem, how to start analyzing a poem. It's just questions that we ask ourselves when we look at a poem. If you've never heard of this method before, I've dropped a link to a Nearpod below. You can follow that and go through the Nearpod on your own time and learn more about this way of analyzing poems. But in brief, TPCASTT is just a series of questions that we ask ourselves, series of places to look in the poem. The first one is T, which stands for title. So before we even read the poem, we want to take a look at the title and see what we can glean just by looking at the title of the poem. So the title of our poem today is Dulce et Decorum Est. Maybe you don't know what that means. I certainly didn't the first time I looked at this poem. I think the only word that I knew was dulce, and that's only because I took some Spanish and I knew that meant sweet. But if you don't know the rest of it and you happen to scroll down, you'll see that we actually do have a little note here that tells us that the Latin phrase, this whole phrase at the end, means it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. So you can always read all the way to the end and see that. If not, it's always a good idea to do some background research on the poems. So I opened up a Wikipedia article that is about Dulce et Decorum Est, and it tells me here that yes, indeed, the title does mean it is sweet and fitting. Great. I know that some of your teachers in the past told you not to use Wikipedia. I am here giving you a pass to use it just for background information. This should not be the last place that you go for your research. It should just be the first place that you go for that background research. Okay, so we know that this means it is sweet and fitting. Still don't really know what to do with that, but I will write that down in my analysis anyway. It is sweet and fitting. All right, so our next step is to paraphrase. I'm not going to read through the whole poem here. You guys can do this on your own, so you can just pause the video, go read through the poem on your own. My suggestion, if you go here to the Poetry Foundation, they do have this handy dandy little button. Click on that and you'll get a speaker reading the poem for you. I think the best way to understand poetry is to hear it spoken out loud, and sometimes it's weird to read to ourselves alone in our room, so you can always just click on this and then read along as they read. That's probably the best way to get the most out of it on the first time, though of course we're not just going to read the poem once. All right, so go read the poem. And once you come back, we're going to talk about paraphrase. So let's try to paraphrase what we just heard in this poem. Slightly different from the more naturey, pleasant, daffodilly poems we may have read in the past. This one is a war poem, right? And so if we were to paraphrase it, we would definitely say that it's about about war, about gas, about watching someone die, about horror, right? So just, it's this feeling of dread, this feeling of helplessness watching the people around you die. And once we finish our analysis, we're going to go learn some more about Wilfred Owen before we actually start our story, start our essay. All right, so our paraphrase, it's about war and it's about gas and it's about watching someone die. Our C, connotation. So we're looking for any words here that have any really important connotations to us. And there's a couple, right? I really like how Owen uses these hyphenated adjectives, right? He has a couple of them. He has knock-kneed. He has bloodshod. And I think that that's just a really interesting way to get across a lot of information in sort of one combined word. So those connotations to me say something about how people are feeling, how people are looking. We have trudge, we have sludge, we have coughing, we have marching in our sleep, we have fatigue, right? So these are people who are at the ends of their ropes, right? And so the connotations here, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, it's cud again. And so, yeah, our connotations here is fatigue. Our connotation is, adjectives with a lot of enjambment, almost not quite enjambment, but a lot of hyphenated ideas, packing a punch into one sentence or phrase. All right, that's my first impression. We'll come back to that later. Allusion, there's a really obvious allusion in this one, of course. It is an allusion to Dulce et Decorum, which at the bottom of our poem tells us is from the Roman poet Horace. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. So if you wanted to be a student, you would look up this poem, right? You'd go and read this poem as well and figure out exactly where this phrase came from. Does Horace think it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country? Does Wilfred Owen think that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country? So the allusion is to Horace, who is Horace, Roman poet from 32 BCE. Shift. There isn't always a shift is what this should read. There isn't always a shift. We can take a look at our poem and try to spy a shift. I think that there is a little bit of one here. It's not quite a shift, but it is a difference, because one of the ways that we can analyze poetry is by looking at rhyme. Not every poem rhymes, but this poem does have a very obvious rhyme scheme. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. Sacks, back, sludge, trudge, boots, hoots, blind, behind, right? And we can see that happen in the first and the last stanzas pretty clearly. Face, pace, in, sin, blood, cud, lungs, tongue, zest, est, glory, mori. Okay, so we have a very formal rhyme scheme going on in our first and last stanzas. Sort of orderly, right? Marching, soldiers in a line. But what happens in the middle of the poem, right? Fumbling, stumbling, time, lime. Okay, so we have A, B, light, sight, drowning, drowning. All right, something happened right here, right? And you can tell because the poem looks different right there in the middle, and our rhyme scheme is broken up by this line, and drowning rhymes with drowning. It's kind of weird. So something odd is happening right here in the middle of the poem. We can tell just by looking at the rhyme scheme. So this isn't quite a shift, but this is definitely a place where the author, the poet, wants us to focus our attention. Ooh, my highlight somehow shifted things over a little bit, but let's focus our attention here anyway. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. This is a really important point in this poem because this is the moment where somebody dies. And our author draws our attention to it in a couple of different ways with the rhyme scheme, but also with just the way that it looks on the page. He wants us to know that this is where we should be looking. So let's write that down. It doesn't quite fit under shift, but that's where I'm going to put it. Rhyme scheme and visual of the poem changes when a fellow soldier dies. Theme. So theme is you're looking for sort of a universal truth. What is the universal truth here? And here, I think that the universal truth is something about war is hell. That's how one of my students described it yesterday when we did this poem in class. I said, what is our universal truth here? And he said, war is hell. And I think that that is pretty accurate, right? Wilfred Owen does not think it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. That's why he calls it a lie. Yeah, so war is hell, you know, the horrors of war, you know, sort of showing people back home what the front lines look like and what it really feels like to die drowning in mustard gas. Sad. All right, last one, title. So the reason why we do our title twice is because titles in poems are so important. Sometimes they're the first line of our poem, but they definitely set up images, feelings, connotations that we need to pay attention to in our poem. So now that we've read the whole thing, let's take another look at the title and see if it means anything different this time around. Dulce et decorum est. So now I know that I've read through the whole poem that this line also appears at the very end. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And he calls it, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And so I think that the reason why he uses that as the title is because it's like sort of the thesis of the poem, if poems were to have thesis statements. So his thesis statement is that it is not sweet and fitting to die for one's country because it is a lie. A poet or a speaker does not believe it is sweet and fitting. Title echoes last sentence of poem. Okay, so this is not the last thing we need to do for a poetic analysis essay. It is just a first step to make sure that we've read through the poem and understand all the different layers that are going on within the poem itself. But the next thing that's important to do is to figure out a little bit about the background of when and where and why this poem was written, right? So some background information is always good to gather. Remember, as you're gathering your background information, to cite the places where you're getting that information from. So if you grab a paraphrase or if you grab a quote from somewhere, remember that you want to write down or at least catch the URL of where you're getting that quote from so that then you can give credit to the original author who gave you that information. Dates, numbers, names, battles that you didn't previously know, all of that stuff should be cited in your final paper. So go off, do some background research. I suggest maybe starting here with our background from the Poetry Foundation about Wilfred Owen. And here you'll learn a lot of interesting things, like the fact that he did serve in World War I. He's an English poet. He died when he was only 25 years old. And in that time, he managed to write a lot of pretty unpopular war poetry because he was writing about the war as he saw it from the front lines. So this is a good place to start, but it's not the last place that you need to go. Remember that you can use your library websites if your school has access to a good, robust library. You can also use Wikipedia, our old friend, to do some background on Wilfred Owen. And if you don't know anything about the First World War, you can go learn some more about World War I there. I always like YouTube videos. They are pretty good. I mean, you want to check the channel, right? History or something like that. But just like those quick 5-minute recaps of like the stuff that you may have forgotten about World War I, just so you can remind yourself things like who was fighting and what it was over. So do your own background research. I'm just going to drop in a couple of important things. British war poet, died at 25, served in World War I, saw death from trenches. All right, and you're obviously going to do more. I'm not writing a whole essay here because I don't want people to steal it and then turn it into their own teachers. So yeah, you're gonna have to do some work. Do some more background, remember to cite it. Then, how do we actually turn this into an essay? Well, we want to start with our introductory paragraph. So our introduction, which should include things like a hook, which can be a lot of different things, interesting fact, question, beautiful sentence, anything that's going to grab somebody's attention. So we start with a hook, and then we move on to introducing the poem and the author. Weirdly, so many of my students forget this part. So this sentence would look like, for example, Wilfred Owen's poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, written during World War I, while he was serving as a soldier in World War I, is about the horrors of war. And I'm stealing that phrase from up here in my themes, right? So this also sort of acts as notes for the rest of my essay. So that's sort of what your introduction is going to look like. You want to make sure that you introduce the full title of the poem and the full name of the author. From here on out, we can refer to the author by their last name, not their first name. For some reason, people like to refer to women authors by their first name. Please do not do this. We're going to refer to the author by their last name, and we can refer to the poem as a shortened version of the title if the title is really long. So we have our hook, we have our introduction, and then we can do some more background, but your best bet is to bail out of the introductory paragraph as quickly as possible. So you can sort of just skip on to your thesis, right? Your thesis statement should, like, even though it's a poetic analysis essay, even though you're going to be analyzing the different themes that are happening in the poem, the feel of the poem, why and where the poem was written, you still need a thesis. It should still be a roadmap to the rest of your essay. So your thesis, I like to begin my theses with like the word while or although, just because that sets up sort of two sides to talk about. So while many poets of his time were writing about the honor and glory one could see in the war, as John seen in poems of his contemporaries, such as Flanders Fields, in case I wanted to write about a second poem. Owen wrote about the brutality and randomness of war, illuminating the problems of using nationalism to spur children, a generation of Edwardian youth to the battlefields. All right, cool. Not a perfect thesis. It's one that I literally just came up with, but I think that this would give us enough to go on with for a 3, 4, 5-page essay. While many poets of his time were writing about the honor and glory one could see in the war, as seen in poems of his contemporaries such as Flanders Fields, I don't know if you actually need this part. We can talk about the poems of his contemporaries in an introductory paragraph, or in the first body paragraph if we want to, but maybe we don't need it in the thesis. While many poets of his time were writing about the honor and glory one could see in the war, Owen wrote about the brutality and randomness of war, illuminating the problems of using nationalism to spur a generation of Edwardian youth to the battlefields. Okay, so a good thesis should act as a roadmap. And this is what my roadmap is telling me is going to happen in the next body paragraphs. So our first body paragraph 1, can be about background of World War I, mentioning the other war poets, talking about maybe even Horace, that guy from Dulce et Decorum, maybe even Horace, talking about the glory of war. All right. So this is going to be my background. This is going to sort of center me in the conversation that's happening as Owen is writing. That's really what a good analysis essay does. It shows us what the conversation is around the poems or stories. All right, so that's our first body paragraph. My thesis statement tells me that my second body paragraph is going to be about the brutality and randomness of war. Body paragraph 2, use textual evidence from the poem to show the brutality and randomness of war. Analyze specific words and phrases, make connections. Right. So this is where we're going to be doing some really good analysis using these like connotations, using these allusions, talking about the themes. All of that stuff can go into body paragraph number 2. And body paragraph number 2 can also be body paragraph number 3, by the way. This is just a really basic outline, but if your paragraphs are getting long or you're talking about more than one idea, you can always break it up into multiple paragraphs. All right, body paragraph 3 tells me that it's going to be about the problems of using nationalism to spur a generation of Edwardian youth to the battlefield, right? So what does Owen think about nationalism or even propaganda? How do I know? Use evidence to show the problems of using war, poetry, propaganda to get people fighting. And this is a really important paragraph because it connects our poem to what was happening at the time and maybe even to what is happening in our world now, because our last paragraph is our conclusion. In our conclusion, you do not, I repeat, do not want to restate or summarize what happened in your essay because your essay is short. And I promise you that your teachers and whoever else is reading this will remember what happened 2 pages ago. They are good readers. So instead, you want to use your conclusion to talk about things like, so what, who cares? Or consequences and solutions. So what, who cares? Why are we still reading this poem? What is the point of reading a poem that is over 100 years old? Well, so what, who cares? We still have war. And we still use propaganda to get children, youth, youngsters, youth to the battlefields. Yeah. I don't know. I think that you could riff off of that idea for a good paragraph, talking about how Owen would feel about that, talking about, you know, the wars that are going on today. whether or not it's ethical to get people to the battlefield in this way. All right, so I'm going to state a couple of things that I think are obvious, but are never as obvious as I think they are. Of course, you're not going to turn in like things like body paragraph 1 when you actually turn in your essay. You're also going to make sure that your whole essay is double spaced, as it should be according to Mla Format, right? You're going to make sure that you're proofreading your essay. So go back through and reread your essay, read it out loud. If you have anybody in your life, a cat, a mother, somebody who can call, read it out loud to them so that they can listen to it and see if you're repeating yourself or if there's a phrase that sounds off. And then one last thing, remember that before you turn in your essay, you must make sure that you have your works cited page. So insert a page break. A works cited page should always start on a new page. And then you're going to have works cited. Because this is Mla Format, it's called a works cited page, not a bibliography or a references page. So works cited, you're going to go all the way over. And I know that one of the works that I'm going to cite is Dolce et Decorum. So it's last name, first name, name of article or, poem, name of container. So like if it was in a collected book of poetry or published in a magazine, something like that. Name of article, name of container, publication date here, how, and then print or web, and then URL if you have that. So make sure to check, you can always check with Purdue OWL. That is everyone. I don't know what Purdue OWL did to convince everyone that they were the best out there, but they're pretty good. So you can always check with Purdue OWL MLA and they'll give you a reminder of how to format and style your whole paper. So remember that Mla Format does not just apply to your citation page or your citations. It has to do with how your whole entire paper looks. So make sure that you check the Mla Formatting and Style Guide on Purdue OWL to make sure that you are setting up the whole thing correctly. Also, I would be remiss if I did not tell you to take another look at your assignment, right? And make sure that you're actually answering your teacher's question. Is the question just do a straight up analysis of a poem, or are they asking you to answer a more specific question? If they're asking you to answer a more specific question, maybe answer that specific question in your thesis statement. That way you make sure that your whole essay answers the assignment. All right. Hopefully this helped somebody out there how to make a poetic analysis essay. See you later. Bye.